The long work began of getting back colonial acquisitions, material, cultural property that has been stolen, sometimes in the most barbaric conditions, sometimes by putting women and children and artists to the sword, and yet has not been returned from Western museums. A prime example, of course, are the Parthenon Marbles. It was here, actually, that we took the first case. It was against the Natural History Museum, which had refused to repatriate human bones and skulls that had been taken in grave robbing expeditions by British soldiers in the 19th century from Tasmania. And it was that case. I went with Mark Stevens to the Natural History Museum, and we found these skeletons that had been robbed from graves for ornamenting Victorian mantelpieces in cardboard boxes, in shoe boxes. And the museum was about to take them out and subject them to some genetic mutilation, some tests, DNA testing, having had them there for a century. And, of course, without the permission of the descendants of these poor, oppressed people. And we took them to court, and they stormed in with their counsel making perhaps the worst, most embarrassing comment ever. He said, "We're just going to cut them about a bit." To which I replied, "They're going to experiment on the bodies of victims of genocide, because the Tasmanian Aborigines were the victims of genocide." And that in the papers the next day did not go well with the donors to the museum, which was forced to mediate. And I have to say that as the result of a mediation between held by two Chief Justices of England and New South Wales, the museum accepted that it had been wrong to experiment on these bodies and wrong to refuse to repatriate them. And as a result, that was 10 years ago, a test case, and now the principle of restoring human remains to countries from which they've been stolen has been accepted by most museums. But now we have a different issue, the issue of cultural heritage. And it is the aim of this book to explain that it is wrong as a matter of international law not to return material and cultural heritage that has been wrongfully taken, no matter whether it was a century or 2 centuries ago. And the first example of that, of course, the Parthenon Marbles. Now, I'm a lawyer. I've had to spend a lot of time looking at the documents, the original evidence of Lord Elgin's depredation. And I have no doubt at all that his was a case of theft. He went as British ambassador, but he lied to the Select Committee when he said he only took them to rescue them because he saw the Turks stealing them. That was a blatant lie, as I've been able to prove by showing that he was never there. He never went to Athens until his heist was largely accomplished. He said that he obtained what is called a firman, the license from the Sultan, which of course was necessary because the Ottomans were very careful about not allowing temples within their jurisdiction to be stripped. He didn't obtain anything of the sort. That was a lie that he and his assistant, his vicar, continued in to, and the Select Committee bought. They never had anything like a firman. There was a letter, but it was not from the Sultan. It was from a lower grade official, and it allowed him only to take molds, not to take anything off the temple. So tracking down the lies of Élgin, which have been perpetuated for 2 centuries by lies and half-truths from the British Museum, has been a major exercise in this book. But I think as a lawyer, international lawyer, I have managed to do so to convict Élgin of theft. Of course, the British Museum changes its story. It's always relied on the Furman theory until it was destroyed by a report that Amal Clooney and Professor, who was actually the great figure, we did a report a few years ago, and they changed their story. They changed it to, they invented a character called Mr. Rashid Aga, who they said was the senior official in Athens and who allowed Élgin, who gave permission to Élgin to remove the statues. This is put in black and white at the entrance to the Duveen Gallery where the statues are. It's a lie. I tracked down this official. He wasn't in Athens. He was a mere postboy in Istanbul who accompanied Élgin's clergyman as they went back with the letter of authorization, which only authorized the taking of mouldings. So this too, the latest story put up 2 years ago by the British Museum, is simply false. Élgin had the money. He was a very rich man. He had the money to buy the marbles. Why didn't he offer? Because he knew that his offer would not be accepted. That's why he didn't offer money for them, never paid a penny, except in bribes. He bribed a couple of Turkish military officials to enormous, lavish amounts of money. Not only money, but English pistols and horses and all sorts of silverware were given to these corrupt officials to turn a blind eye while his workmen stripped the temple. Now, it seems to me, and I'm not an art connoisseur, but the frieze, which is an amazing piece of artwork by Phidias, showing people walking, talking, drinking particularly, it's terrific to see them drinking, in this, a parade, which is a ceremony of peace, a ceremony of peace in a democracy, in the first civilization that we can actually call civilized, this Greece of 440 BC. It's like an old newsreel as you see the motion of the horses and the parade. And it is, I think, the greatest wonder of the ancient world that still survives. But does it survive? No, it's cut in half. Half of it is in the British Museum, stolen by an aristocrat who abused his position as British ambassador. And it is in the interest not only of Greece, but in the interests of the world, that this extraordinary picture of our first democracy, of a celebration of peace in Pericles' democracy, should be reunited, and reunited not in the gloomy Duveen room of the British Museum, named after an arts fraudsman. Duveen was a wicked fraudsman who made his money by certifying or getting Berenson to certify works of art and selling them at an enormous profit that enabled him to bribe the British establishment into a knighthood and then a lordship, and then to have the British Museum trustees accept that he could paint the marbles white, clean them up and paint them white in the Duveen room. No, it's the marbles have to come out of the Divine Room and have to go to the new Acropolis Museum, where they will be put in beneath the Parthenon, just through the glass windows, back beneath the blue attic sky. That's where they belong, and that's where the world, as well as Greece, can see this amazing tribute to peace and democracy. But there's more, because when I started on this work with Norman Palmer and Amal Clooney some years ago, it was confined to the case for the marbles. But since then, we have had the remarkable conversion of President Macron, who has said not only should the marbles go back, but the 90% of African cultural property which is held in European museums should go back. And he commissioned an extraordinary report by Sarre and Savoy, anthropologists, who said this, and I'll read this extract from the report because I think it encapsulates the case for sending back looted cultural property to the countries from which they were looted. To fall under the spell of an object, to be touched by it, to be moved emotionally by a piece of art in a museum, brought to tears of joy, to admire its forms of ingenuity, to like the artwork's colour, to take a piece of it, a photo of it, to let oneself be transformed by it. All these experiences, which are also forms of access to knowledge, cannot simply be reserved to the inheritors of an asymmetrical history, to the benefactors of an excess of privilege and mobility. And I think that argument, which converses all the most horrific, brutal crimes against humanity committed in the 19th century by the armies of Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and Belgium, is one that now has to be conceded. And Macron says that the ethnological museums of France will be inspected, and that property that was brutally taken, stolen in war as pillage, as spoils of war, will be returned to museums in the countries of origin. And that, too, it seems to me, will support the case for returning the marbles to Greece. It's been an extraordinary time that I spent researching this book, going around museums in Britain and Europe with a notepad, noting the lies and half-truths on the labels of this stolen property, and noting the euphemism that has infected curators of museums that exhibit loot. For example, British heroes never fire shots at indigenous people. They always fire warning shots. They can fire hundreds of warning shots, but they never shoot straight. And there's a shield dropped by an Aboriginal shot by James Cook, a great explorer, so he mustn't be thought to murder anyone. Yet in his diary, Cook himself says, "I shot directly at the man with the shield who dropped it." So the euphemisms that accompany labels. And perhaps one of the worst examples of the barbarity of the British Army, which had its own looting agenda. It actually had its laws and rules for looting, was in Ethiopia, the Magdala expedition in 1867. It was a massive expedition, 40 elephants 200 donkeys, and off they went, because the Christian, he was a Christian king who had been embraced by Victoria, Queen Victoria, who'd given him a pistol as to celebrate the bonds between Ethiopia and Britain. But he was upset because Britain wasn't answering his messages for help against some unruly Muslim neighbours. So he took some hostages. He released them, of course, as soon as the British expedition came close. He begged for peace. No way. Disraeli, in an election campaign, had spurred on this massive mission, which was accompanied by a British Museum official to get the best of the art that could be stolen. And they went to it. They killed 500 of the king's followers with no casualties because they had superior weapons, and they went in and they looted prodigiously and burnt the palace to the ground. But when they got inside, they found the king dead with the Victoria's pistol beside him. He'd committed suicide because he couldn't bear the thought that his allies were invading. But the loot was massive. It took those 20 elephants and 200 donkeys to carry it back to the ships. The gold was and silver and the icons and church details and so forth, all collected by the British Museum, put into a booty auction, which would raise money for the soldiers and for the cost of this expedition, like so many. And finally, 150 years later, I noticed that the V&A, which is part of the British Museum, was going to have an exhibition about the Magdala looting. And I thought I'd go and see what was said. It was run by an old friend of mine, Tristram Hunt, a progressive figure in the museum world. And so I turned up at the V&A. I couldn't see the Magdala exhibition anywhere. I walked across the courtyard to look for it, the Sackler courtyard. I went across to the Arts and Education Centre, the Sackler Arts and Education Centre. The V&A is one great advertisement for opioids. But I couldn't find it. Finally, I did discover up a few corridors and around the corner in the diamond section, there was one little case which had the king's crown, the crown of a king who is still sanctified in Ethiopia, a crown that was stolen by a soldier who was paid £4 by the attaché for the British Museum. And there it was, and I wondered, I took a note of what was said on the to introduce this little case of Magdala loot. And this is what it said. As is often the case with items of this nature in museum collections, there are many questions surrounding their history and provenance. The 150th anniversary is an opportunity to reconsider the role of these objects as witnesses to a controversial period in Ethiopian and British history. That was all it said. This crime against humanity, no more than a controversial period in British and Ethiopian history. I don't think, having walked around the main museums in this country, that the curators are capable. I don't think they're capable of being honest. They use these weasel words to cover up for the most bloodthirsty attacks and looting by the British Army. Of course, the worst, actually, is the old Summer Palace in China, which Elgin's son, the 8th Earl of Elgin, was responsible. Now, the Opium Wars are probably the worst crime against humanity because the British government, as an act of policy, addicted 12 million Chinese to opium, cheap opium, to reverse the trade that had got into out of kilter because of the British love of Chinese tea. And so wars were fought to allow Jardine Matheson to put in cheap Indian opium to addict the Chinese. And when the Chinese refused, then war was ordered. And the French and the British Army led by Elgin Jr., by Lord Elgin's son, the man who despoiled Greece, then made their attack on the Summer Temple, which was the equivalent, in a way, of the Parthenon in Asia. It was full of the most beautiful fountains and museums and libraries. And he ordered his men to loot it for 3 days. The French participated. And then he ordered them to burn it down. And the French said, well, we can't really, that's against the law of war. No, said Elgin Jr., on we go. And not only did they burn it down, they burnt 150 workers with it, eunuchs and servants and so forth. That was in the 1860s. There, a case, a dreadful case of British looting of and killing of the Chinese. Of course, little China was looted again during the Boxer Rebellion. It was looted by the Japanese just before and during the Second World War. We care very much about Nazi loot, and we've got laws about it, but there's been no recompense for Japanese loot of Asian countries, and that's yet another example that is coming. Well, how do we go ahead? I believe that international law, and this was Norman and Amal's view, has emerged at this stage, and it's a strange creation process, international law, but has emerged far enough to say that there is a norm, an international law rule, requiring the return of property, cultural property, that has been wrongfully obtained. And that international law rule simply awaits a decision by the International Court of Justice, and the way you get an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, because Britain won't allow Greece to take it to that court, is to get the General Assembly or UNESCO to ask for an advisory opinion. I'm afraid UNESCO is hopeless. It has no money. Donald Trump has finalized the American withdrawal from UNESCO next month, and 22% of its funds will be cut. The General Assembly, however, voted, 105 nations voted in favor of the restitution principle when Greece asked them to last year. I believe that gives a majority to refer the issue of the Parthenon sculptures to the International Court of Justice. And ultimately, we will need a convention. We'll need an international convention which sets out the principles of return. I don't think everything should be returned. I think the Rosetta Stone, for example, which Egypt claims, should not be returned because it is, there are 17 Rosetta Stones in existence, and it was only in the British Museum that the cryptographers were able to discover its great capacity for shedding light on the languages of ancient Egypt. So let the museum keep the Rosetta Stone. Not the bust of Nefertiti, though, which is in Berlin and should never have been there. It was a corrupt German archaeologist covered it up with mud so that it wouldn't be noticed and smuggled it out of Egypt. And when the Egyptians realized that they had lost this extraordinary figure of Queen Nefertiti, they demanded in 1936 that it come back. And the issue, I discovered a letter written by Adolf Hitler to the Egyptian chancellor saying, no, you shall never get it back. I want it as the highlight of the Führer Museum that he was building in Linz, his hometown. He was something of an artist, Hitler, and he wanted this Queen Nefertiti as the centerpiece of his own museum, for which he looted himself so vigorously. And then, of course, you have the story of the Monuments Men and of the Stalin's brigade, who still, and the problem at the moment is Russia. It's not China. China is all in favor of restitution, but Russia still clings to the spoils of war theory that Stalin developed. Anyway, I want to thank those who have helped me with this interesting task of trying to develop a new area of law, down to writing a convention, an international convention. It's very easy to write an international convention. I did it in a few days. Unfortunately, to get an international convention accepted generally takes about 10 years. But that is something ahead. I want to thank not only my own staff, Sabrina, and others who helped, but also John Leffas. John Leffas is a most extraordinary Greek businessman who is consumed with the idea of getting back the Elgin marbles. He will help me distribute copies of the book. We'd arranged to send it to every MP, and then they called an election, so we have to wait till the next lot to read it, to send it around to the United Nations and to all other possible decision makers who we could recruit to the cause of the marbles. But this, at least, I hope, is proof, and proof positive, that Elgin stole the marbles, and this is a way forward for all cultural property, the Elgin marbles being perhaps the foremost, to be returned. I have to say, the quickest way of returning the Elgin marbles is quite simply to vote for Jeremy Corbyn, because he has promised to do so, and promised to restore other looted property. But if that fails, then there is no prospect of any Conservative government moving on the issue, and it will have to be taken to the International Court of Justice. And there, I'm confident that ultimately it will succeed. So my thanks to John and his wife Maria and his family foundation for supporting this work, and we will continue until we get the marbles back together again. Thank you.
Welcome to Hellenic Television, Mr. Robertson. Who owns history?
Well, a lot of people, Americans particularly, think that American billionaires own it, because they buy it and they have it in their private homes and their gated communities, and when they die, they donate it for tax deduction reasons for their estate to the Gettys and the Metropolitan Museums of Art. But I think history belongs to those who make it, and those who create it, and those to whom it means most.
What prompted you to go down this route? You're a human rights lawyer, a renowned human rights lawyer. So what prompted you to go down the avenue of history in terms of items, in terms of artifacts?
Some unfinished business. I was instructed by the Greek government back in Mr. Papandreou's time to advise on the Elgin marbles. I found a lot of misunderstanding. I did my own research. I found so many lies, so many half-truths, so many wrong appreciations of Elgin, who I declared as a thief. He stole the marbles on any view. And so I always thought I would like, when the Greek government dropped the ball, it wasn't perhaps right for them. We did a report, heard nothing more about it. But I thought one day I will come back to this and I will publish the truth about the plunder, because that's what it was, of the Parthenon. And it happened that a very patriotic, philanthropic Greek, John Lefas, who is a businessman, international businessman, was very keen that I should do that. And he agreed to promote the book, not just to the British Parliament, but to the United Nations and to the General Assembly, where it must be, the argument must be heard. So he encouraged me, and I went back to writing it. And of course, while I was writing it, President Macron came out and said that the wrongfully taken cultural property of Africa should be returned from France. So that's another strong argument in the case.
How would you answer the British Museum, who thus far have not really played ball with regard to returning the marbles, which, as you quite rightly say, were plundered, not legally obtained? How has the museum reacted, A, to your book, but B, to you personally in doing all this research, and what has their reaction been?
They haven't had time to react. They've kept silent so far. I wait with interest because I do show in my book that their arguments for Έλγιν are simply false, and their latest argument, that he was given permission by a Mr. Rashid Aga, is ridiculous. So, I engage with them on that point. But on the other hand, I say that they should keep the Rosetta Stone, which was actually did its miracle while it was in the museum. It was deciphered while it was there. There are 17 other copies, but the marbles are unique. And I think the best case is probably visual. I start my pictures with, first of all, a picture of the new Acropolis Museum with the marbles and the Parthenon looking down. And then I compare it to this miserable dark gallery in North London dedicated to Joseph Devine, who was an art fraudsman. So that is, I think, makes the point. That these are, look, for me, this is more, I'm not Greek, although I'm Australian, which means I'm part Greek. There are a lot of Greeks in Australia. But I think, for me, this is an amazing, the frieze is the most important work of art in the world, because it shows the first people who were democrats celebrating peace. It is a celebration of peace. People are walking, talking, drinking. Drinking is, I'm glad to say, very important, and feasting. And they are human values. And the value, this was what humanity was able to achieve in 440 BC, the first example of civilization. And it's like an old black and white movie that you can suddenly see of our first civilization. And the British Museum, by denying the return, is like tearing a picture in half. So I don't think that the British Museum has the ethics on their side. And I hope that the law will soon be against them as well.
On that point of the law, according to your very deep research, you say that it would be possible to actually go to court to repatriate the marbles.
Yes.
Is there a reason why that might not have already taken place?
No, it could have taken place a few years ago when the report that I wrote with Amal and with Norman Palmer was produced. But nothing happened. I think something could still happen because the Greek government got 105 nations in the General Assembly to support it last year. That's all it takes to get a reference to the... But some Greek politicians appear to be nervous. They would rather have this platform of complaining than perhaps run the risk of losing. But I don't think Pericles would have taken that attitude.
Well, because I suppose losing is then finite. It should it be lost?
No,
whereas
it's
now
not.
there is always an open opportunity.
Well, there's not, because the British government is adamant. It won't even mediate.
Yes.
Unless Jeremy Corbyn is elected.
In which case you believe that he would, well, he's already said,
Yes.
that he would return the marbles.
Yes, so any Greek industrialist who believes in getting the marbles back should support Labour.
Are you in favour of all artefacts wrongly obtained to be returned to their
I have a
country of
chapter
origin?
showing the distinctions
Right.
that should be made. The Egyptians want the Rosetta Stone back. I say no, it should stay. Stay where it was deciphered, stay where the magic was discovered.
Right. Well, your book certainly gives a lot of food for thought, and the fact that you've called it Élgin's loot, I think makes it very plain that these artefacts were most definitely not legally obtained.
They were stolen.
Or lawfully obtained.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson.